It keeps telling me the browser's not working, but it's like, yeah, I don't know.
It look well. We'll let it rip, and here we go. I think as soon as I click all these various things, and our music isn't working, but that's all right. Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of In with the Old. We're the video podcast focused on dispelling myths, building appreciation for God's word, and helping you rediscover the Old Testament for the life of faith. Welcome to our penultimate episode of 2023. We have a guest coming on tonight, and it's going to be a very fun discussion on Ecclesiastes, Genesis, and a whole bunch more stuff. But I don't want to steal his thunder. Let me first bring in my co-host, Dr. Tim. Dr. Tim, we missed you last week with the interview with Dr. Wilder, but happy to have you back. How are you doing?
Oh, Brian, I am doing very well. And how appropriate tonight we're going to be talking about Ecclesiastes. And so if anything can go wrong, I think it's an appropriate night for it to go wrong. And we'll keep trying to muscle through in an upside down world. And that leads us to our guest for tonight. This is Dr. Russ Meek. And Dr. Russ Meek is an Old Testament scholar. He's published many articles, and he actually has a new book out that's going to be the topic of our conversation tonight, Ecclesiastes and the Search for Meaning in an Upside Down World. We've loved to do these author interviews in the podcast, and we're very excited to have Dr. Meek tonight. So, Dr. Meek, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here. So Dr. Meek has kind of run in the same circles as we are, but run before us. So Dr. Meek got his PhD from Midwestern Baptist, like Tim and I did. And we were even talking beforehand, Russ, right, that I don't think we've actually met in person yet, but because of the way these things work, we've communicated, we've dialogued before. I attended one of your papers a few years ago at ETS. But I'm really excited to get you on here tonight to talk a bit about your journey and a bit about Ecclesiastes as well. So to kick it off, I like asking any of our guests that come on, what drew you to the Old Testament? Because I don't think we all have kids here, right? And you go to the like kindergarten, first grade. What do you want to be when you grow up? I've heard lots of things at those meetings. I don't think I've ever heard Old Testament professor. So I'm always curious, what got you into the field, and how has kind of your personal life, your personal journey shaped your work in this field?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I will say, when I talk to my kids and I say, do you want to be a professor when you grow up? No. Do you want to be a scientist? Yes, you do want to be a scientist. So yeah, so my introduction to the Old Testament was when I was 12 years old, maybe 13. I don't know. I was in 7th grade, so however old that is. And my mom got me Eugene Merrill's OT survey textbook at a garage sale. And so I just started reading it at breakfast in the mornings. And that kind of started that. I didn't become a Christian for a long time after that, and not because of Eugene Merrill's book, but other reasons. So the real thing that drew me to the Old Testament, man, was so I grew up in the church. I joke that I was a Baptist long before I was a Christian, even before I was born. Man, I had a difficult go of it, so a big part of like my coming to the Old Testament is growing up in a really abusive family. So my parents were divorced when I was, and then I lived about half a block away from my grandmother, and so she had this just enormous role in my life, and that even increased, especially like when my parents got divorced when I was super young. My dad was an alcoholic, and so my mom got remarried. So my grandmother died when I was around 12, and then my mom got remarried, and she married a guy who was a deacon at a local Baptist church there, and he ended up being just like super abusive. Like it was a very, very difficult teenage years. yeah. So I don't. I can just say that I don't have to go into all of it, except to say that it was just a terrifying experience. To just the violence and the kind of the anger and not really knowing what would cause it. It was just really hard. And I took this like to the church we were going to the leadership, that this is what's going on in my home, because he was a deacon there at the church. And they were like, well, you're gossiping, you need to submit to your authority, and don't try to tear this man down. And so that made me like really angry, really disillusioned with the church. And it was just, I was just like, man, I don't want anything to do with this, essentially. And so before I go off to college, though, I went to Super Summer. You guys have that where you live?
Yes.
All right.
Oh, I don't.
So I was at Super Summer. Yeah, it's a church camp, and it was at Ouachita Baptist University. I could not afford to go to college there, and they didn't offer me very many scholarships. I always like to get that in whenever I talk about OBU, in the hopes that someone will hear this and say, man, we should offer kids more scholarships. But there on the campus of OBU, I got saved. I gave my life to Christ. The Lord convicted me. I'm not like a super emotional, like experience God in profound ways sort of person. But that was one moment when, man, I'm like sitting there under a tree and just feel the Holy Spirit like so clearly, like you tell me like, hey, you are not a Christian. And I had this little Bible that my grandmother had given me, that had like the Romans road. It's like on the first page, it's like Rusty, go to page whatever, and you go to that page and the verse is underlined, and it's like, go to this page. And so I like pull that out and like get saved there. I like to say like my grandmother led me to Christ years after she was dead, and just her faithful witness. In addition to that, there's like all sorts of it. But getting to the point, what brought me to the Old Testament? So I get saved. I still like don't want anything to do with the church. I'm still angry and just hurt. And I go to Henderson State University across the street from Ouachita, and the BCM director there is this guy named Neil. And like whatever you imagine, like some dude from Arkansas being, like, that's him, right? Like in all the best ways. And Neil was like, I'm start sharing some of this stuff with him, and he's like, you need to read these Psalms. And he told me about the imprecatory Psalms, where it's like, God break the teeth in their mouths, may their wife be a widow and their children grow up childless, like this crazy stuff and you're like, it's even there in the Gideon Bible that my grandma gave me, but I've never, had never read those parts. And it's insane. And so I started reading those Psalms, and that just opened the door to eventually forgive. Like it took a lot to get there, but like those Psalms like help me know that God does care. Like God does care about me and my experiences, and he's like big enough for me to tell him that I don't have to like fake that I'm happy and everything is okay. He's actually gave us like a model for taking those sorts of things to him. And so, man, from then on, I was just hooked on the Old Testament. And there's still all kinds of stories about just like really messed up people. Like I struggled with drug and alcohol addiction, like long into, even while I was at Midwestern doing a master's degree, I've struggled with drug and alcohol there. And I read these about Jacob, and like you think like Jacob is a horrible person, and yet like God loved him and God chose him and pursued him. And like that was like, oh my gosh, like God really does love me. Like it's true, and so it was like the imprecatory Psalms and the story of like Jacob just being a scoundrel. Like I was able to identify with that and see like, man, this is a God who actually like cares for his people and loves us, not because of anything we do, but because he's good. And um, so I thought, man, if I can spend my life helping other people, like messed up, not good people, but like messed up people like who, like me, who like struggled with um, drugs and alcohol, who like came from broken families, who didn't know, like, man, does God actually love me? Like, if I can show them the Old Testament, then like maybe like the Lord will get a hold of their lives too. And so that's what drew me to the Old Testament. It's a really long-winded way of getting around to that, but
No, thank you for sharing your journey. I think that's really powerful, and I appreciate you walking us through that. The Old Testament often gets a rap, right? It's the violent, it's the awkward testament. It's people who have not been in it a lot are like, God back there scares me. But I think you highlight a key part of that is for those that have gone through difficult times. You can see God is not absent from those. He is in broken situations, and that I think is maybe part, as you even said, right, of where you focused your time in the Old Testament. So you've spent a lot of your research interest in the wisdom literature books, but most especially you said Ecclesiastes before we went live, and that's Ecclesiastes is one of those interesting books, right? If you have a stereotype of a Bible book and a Christian should talk about these things, Ecclesiastes doesn't fit any of those things. Um, I guess unique is the best word I can have for it. Let's say we might have listeners that are unfamiliar with it because of the Old Testament books. It is one of those odd ones. So let's say you could pitch it to them. Someone's never heard of the book of Ecclesiastes before. What is your elevator pitch to say, go read this book?
man, I'd say it's the most Christian book in the whole Old Testament, right? It presents a vision of life that looks backward at the Garden of Eden and forward to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And if we can truly grasp this idea of like enjoying the gifts that God has given us, food, relationships, I won't say, I'll say wine, but not for Southern Baptists, and and work. If we can grasp that vision of life, then I think we can present a really compelling apologetic for the Christian faith.
Oh yeah, I love that. It's the most Christian book. Yeah, absolutely agree. So let's use that as the segue into your book. So the book, and for those of you live with us tonight, I just posted a link to the Amazon page for this book, but it's called Ecclesiastes and the Search for Meaning in an Upside Down World. Here it is right here. Have it on screen. I want to start off by congratulating you. So this is a popular level summary of your dissertation work. You got it down to somewhere around 70 pages. And that right there is a Herculean effort. I don't know how you did it. And it's still fantastic because both Tim and I have gone or are going through the process of trying to distill our dissertations down for publication. And I don't know how you did it, Russ, but fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your book is dealing with this phrase upside down world. Let's start there. What do you mean by the idea of an upside down world as the Bible and especially Ecclesiastes presents it?
Yeah. All right. So a world that's unlike what it's supposed to be, that where if we start with Genesis 1 through 3, the world, God makes the world, it's good. He blesses it. Everything is great. You have husband and wife living together, enjoying the garden and all of that. And then they sin and they're expelled from the garden, right? God says, if you sin, here are the consequences for your sin. They sin. They experience those consequences. But then if you keep reading, just like one more chapter over, one more page over, you find out like right away, Abel brings a offering to the Lord that he accepts, and it's like the best portions of his flock and all this. God accepts the offering. Cain gets really angry, kills Abel, and then goes on to like found a city and live this long life and have descendants and all of this. So if you kind of have that in your mind, and then you read like Deuteronomy or something like that, and you see this whole idea of like, okay, if I am faithful to the Lord, if Israel is faithful to the Lord as a people, then God will like, land and material wealth and progeny or children. And you're like, okay, but this whole Cain and Abel story, like the opposite happened there, and so that's what I'm talking about with the upside down world, when things don't go the way that we think that they should go.
And that's a really honest approach to the world, right? Because I think all of us can look in our own lives and look at situations in the world today and go, this seems antithetical to how we'd expect things to be. So would it be fair to say that the upside down world is the world we inhabit as opposed to the world God designed?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
So
that's right.
You characterize this as the most Christian book, and I want to bring that back because this is where I think we see some of the value of this book. This book deals with the world as it is in light of the world as it should have been back in the beginning. So a key phrase, I grew up on the NASB. I'm just curious, this is off topic, but what versions did you read growing up, Tim and Russ? So I did the NASB, which I think screwed up my English diction and sentence structure because I had a very like broken style because of that. But what versions did you grew up reading?
Yeah, so I grew up, Brian, NIV, NASB, and then New King James. So then by the time I got to college, it was just like, oh wow, every translation really is a translation. And but yeah, for me it was a smorgasbord. Don't tell anyone. I really did like the NLT as well, especially when I was like 12 or 13. But that was me.
Don't worry, this isn't going live out on the internet, Tim. You're fine.
Yeah. What about
Russ,
you?
how about
Yeah,
you?
I grew up on NIV, and then when I became a Christian, I started reading the NLT, and same thing. I always tell people like, hey, please don't spread this around, but I actually really like the translation.
Yeah.
If we're having confession time, for my devotions, I sometimes go to the Message. It's not translation. I totally get that, but it's sometimes, like devotionally, I'm like, I like the phrasing, I like that. So that's my Bible confession. Anyway.
Yeah, that's what we read. That's what we read to my kids. And I'm always like, hey, when you go to homeschool group, don't tell anybody that you read this. Like just.
Nice. Exactly right. Like. People are going to judge me because I read it. Yeah. I'll make sure to say it's not translation, but it's good. The reason I asked is because I'm used to the NASB wording, and the key phrase, the kind of theme of the book in Ecclesiastes 1:2 is vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And I like that word vanity. Jerome, the church father, has a beautiful quote. He says, "What's more vain than this vanity, that the earth which was made for humans stays? The humans themselves, the lords of the earth, return to dust," or suddenly dissolve into dust. Your work, Russ, is on that idea of vanity, and you make some interesting connections. So I want to kind of leave this as open-ended and let you walk us through this however you want.
Okay.
What is vanity in the book of Ecclesiastes, and how has that helped shape kind of our whole way through the book?
Yeah, man, that's a huge question. Sorry, I have my son here. I'm trying to. Hey, okay.
That's all right.
Sorry. Well, all right. So vanity, meaningless. That is how we've almost exclusively come to think of the word because of Jerome and his translation. That has dominated the history of interpretation. So the reason I started studying Ecclesiastes actually is because I was in doing my master's degree there at Midwestern, and man, I was in a horrible place, just drinking heavily, like regularly using opiates, and I was just in this like cycle, man, where of just deep sin, totally isolated. I'd isolated myself from anyone. To like really know anyone because I well, let me take that back. I had like two really close friends, but I like isolated. I kept this sin from them, and so for 3 years, I'm like going to classes in the mornings and doing great in school, and like I worked as a bartender at night, and I'm just like using opiates and drinking heavily, and but was just like in this really dark place, as you can imagine. And I just got to the point, where I was like, man, if there's a dude in the Bible who can like say everything is meaningless and like he gets a whole book in the Bible, then like maybe there's hope for me. And so I really started studying it as kind of a like last ditch effort. Like, man, am I really a Christian? Like, is this and now I look back and I say, well, like, yeah, I was miserable. Like, it's like a really good thing when you're in sin to be miserable about it if you're a Christian. And so I wanted to study this book. I asked like our, Blake Hearson to study it with me. And so we did. So like for independent study, translating it. And he like was like, hey, there's like there's some French scholars who think that this word hevel, that's the Hebrew word translated vanity, like they think it might be a reference to Abel. And so then that like put me on this trajectory of like, okay, what does this term actually mean? And so like and so that started that kind of in the middle of that period of studying Ecclesiastes. I had my second like crazy experience with the Lord. He like woke up one morning. I like remember it like it was yesterday. I had this like red comforter on my bed. I woke up and the Lord was just spoke so clearly to me, like, hey, this like what you're doing is not okay. And like, my dad was an alcoholic, and he was like, your dad. And I'm not like a prophet. I'm not saying this is like scripture. I'm just saying, so I just like the Lord is like, your dad didn't like be like, oh man, I want to grow up to be an alcoholic and ruin everyone's life that's around me. It just happened like this, you just like start drinking and once a week, and then it's 3 times a week, and then it's every day kind of thing. And so like I got up, dumped my pills in the toilet, flushed them, called my job as a bartender, and was like, hey, I quit. I can't come in anymore. And the Lord just totally like delivered me like in a miraculous way. And like I stress that just to say like, man, like it was the Lord's work completely. And I know that like it's not that easy for other people, and when I was on antidepressants for a while, and when I stopped those, I had horrible withdrawal symptoms, but not with this. And so I'm like so gracious, so thankful to the Lord for that. So like I'm in the middle of studying this book, the Lord is renewing my heart and convicting me of sin and changing my life. And so like these go together in the sense that what I discovered or learned, and I'm not the first person to make this connection, is that this book of Ecclesiastes is like absolutely steeped in the book of Genesis. Okay, so there's all of these allusions in Ecclesiastes to the book of Genesis. And so you start reading it like in that framework, and then you start to think about this word vanity or meaningless or hevel. And you have to start saying, well, man, this is the name Abel. Like it's expelled exactly the same way. And so that is kind of what got me on this trajectory of like, man, this guy, Kohelet, he's not saying the world is meaningless. He's not saying it's vain even. He's saying he's wanting us to pick up on like this world is Abelish or Abel-like. It is in some way reflective of this narrative in Genesis 4 where everything gets turned upside down, And so I said earlier that Ecclesiastes is the most Christian book in the Old Testament. And I just lament that our translation history has essentially taken this book away. And we've had to figure out, okay, how does this book fit into the canon? And usually it's something along the lines of everything is meaningless without God. And like that's totally true. Everything is meaningless without God. But that is not what Ecclesiastes is saying. Ecclesiastes is using this word hevel or Abel to take a hard look at things in life that are upside down or messed up. You know, he says the fastest runner doesn't always win the race, or in the place of righteousness there was wickedness, or a man can live 1,000 years twice over and father 100 children, but if he doesn't enjoy those things, then that is hevel. It's not meaningless, but it is really messed up. It is upside down. And so when the book uses this phrase vanity, it's not vanity. He's saying this is the world as you're living in it. This is the experience of life under the sun, is this upside downness. And so he takes like a really realistic and just frank look at the life that we live. And that's so hopeful, I think, to say like, man, no, it's not meaningless, it's not vain. It's Abel like. And then like he also gives us a pathway toward that. And so yeah, one other thing about the translation aspect is that if we think about the word bread, you have like all of these different types of bread. You know, in Arkansas, of course, we have like biscuits and cornbread, and hot water cornbread, and normal bread, like Wonder Bread, whatever. And that's like what hevel is like. Okay, it's super broad range of meaning. It's a broad range of meaning in Hebrew. It's a broad range of the word metiates in Greek also has a broad range of meaning. The word vanitas is like taking this word bread and translating tortilla every single time you see it. And so like it narrows it way down to a singular meaning and locks you into now every time you see it, every time you see the word tortilla, you're thinking about a particular thing. And there might be some variation like spinach tortillas or whatever, but like it is a flat piece of bread made out of flour or something, you know, and it cuts us off from a lot of options, interpretive options. So okay, I think I've said enough for now. Well, go ahead. Sorry.
That's a very helpful analogy, because that's one of the reasons why, listeners, we've talked in the past, like original language study is important, because every translation, even the best ones, sometimes rob us of interpretive options simply because they have to, or in this case, as you're saying, there's some translation history behind that. Do you trace that back to Jerome kind of saying vanity, and then that kind of locks it in? Is that where you see the trajectory for this translation change happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And you see like the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament uses metiates, which has a really broad range of meaning. And then Jewish interpretation always like their emphasis is on the metaphorical meaning. So even if you give it like the metaphorical meaning of hevel is something like breath or vapor, and even if you do that, use that word, it's not a pessimistic term. Breath is not, vapor is not inherently negative. And so, but with vanitas, that like locked in for some reason. And especially like King James, you know, vanity of vanities, it's like it rolls off the tongue better than like, you know, Abel of Abels or vapor of vapors or something like that. So, and then even the New Living Translation, it uses meaningless. So it's like we got locked into a very pessimistic and negative reading of this word, and usually that's mostly not a huge deal, having like one word kind of off. But in a book of 12 there's only 12 chapters in Ecclesiastes, and this word appears like 38 times, which is like almost
incredible,
or just over half of its usages, yeah, in the whole Old Testament. So yeah, so they locked us in a bad way. Yeah.
And just real quick, Tim, and then I'll let you hop in. For our listeners, the repeating of the phrase in Genesis 1, or sorry, not Genesis, Ecclesiastes 1:2, Abel of Abels, or vapor, vanity of vanities. What's that doing grammatically? Because right, that means something very specific in Hebrew. Repeating it like that.
Yeah, it's I keep thinking plural of majesty, but that's not the plural of majesty. So it it is like using it like the vanity of vanities, like the or the stop saying that. Vapor of vapors, the Abel of Abels. It's like the Song of Songs. Like it's a programmatic statement for like this is the most able thing, like Holy of Holies or something. So superlative. That's the word I'm looking for.
So yeah, that's listeners. When you see repeated phrases like that in the Old Testament, that's the Hebrew superlative. The Song of Songs is the greatest song. Yahweh is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Right? Superlatives. Mm-hmm. So this book, what is it talking about? It's talking about right the quintessential nature of the upside down world. That things are, if we're doing the Jewish interpretation, transitory, or things are upside down fundamentally. At their essential level. So you just mentioned that trigger that I was like, oh, let's call that out real quick. Tim, it looked like you want to jump in. Sorry, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, Russ, I so appreciate first you sharing your story, because when we come to the Old Testament, one of the things that draws so many people to it is it's just honesty. And that's what, as we read Ecclesiastes, or even as we think about Genesis, and especially Genesis 1 through 11, the Bible is so gut wrenchingly honest that at times we almost want to kind of hide our face and say, "Do you really have to be that real?" But I've found it apologetically helpful, or just evangelistically helpful, because we live in a culture, and especially when you think of the millennial generation or down, so many people have a very realistic outlook, a very high degree of cynicism or distrust for institutions or people or even truth claims to some degree. And so I've, at least even pastorally and with some of my friends who are where you were, questioning the faith, like, what is this real? I can point them to Ecclesiastes and say, not only does the Bible address this, but God gives us an incredible permission to pursue these thoughts, but ultimately to pursue them to an end of faith. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, of how the narrative of Genesis coincides with what we see in Ecclesiastes, and how that can practically help some people who might be struggling with some of those questions of life.
Yeah, that was a huge piece for me, was realizing that Ecclesiastes is taking just an honest look at life, recognizing that stuff is messed up. Like, hey, like, you know what? If you're like, if you grew up like in an abusive family, like that's messed up. Like God doesn't say like, oh, you need to, you don't need to gossip. He says like, hey, I'm gonna defend the orphan and the widow. Like that is what God says. Yeah, like it's refreshing to know that Scripture is honest. Sorry, I could hear my kids yelling downstairs. I totally lost my train of thought. But the apologetic value is what we're talking about, and like taking a realistic look at life. Yeah, and so yeah, it takes a realistic look at life. And then what was like really helpful for me, and in coming out of addiction, is that not only does it acknowledge like, hey, things are really messed up, like, and which is great, like that is, the acknowledgement is wonderful, but it also gives a path forward, right? So like the coping mechanism I learned the first time I used drugs, I was like 11 years old. And so the coping mechanism I learned was drugs and alcohol. Like that's what I saw from my parents. And even like I didn't see that. Obviously my grandmother was like a teetotaler, and yet she also, like, I can remember her crying like once, and so she just was a very like even kill, like not too happy, not too sad, just like, very straight level. So like I did not know like how to navigate life or apart from substance abuse. And in Ecclesiastes, so the apologetic value, how this book can really help us, is that it offers a way forward in saying, acknowledging the reality of life under the sun is messed up, it's upside down. And then throughout the book, there's the carpe diem passages, the seize the day passages, where he says like, God has given you gifts, and those gifts are food, they are wine, they are relationships, a spouse, and they are work. And he makes a big deal out of the work aspect, especially where he says like there's no yet grown is the word it uses, or value or ultimate gain. There's nothing left over when you work. But and that's where like we Americans especially go wrong. We're looking for a legacy. We're looking for something to fulfill us. And Ecclesiastes is like, hey, all of these things, food, a spouse, that is not going to fulfill you, but they are a halic, a portion, a reward, a gift that is to be enjoyed like in the here and now. And so when it's like, okay, how do I make it through this upside down world? And my tendency was substances. Someone else may be, I don't know, food or exercise or sex or whatever other thing. And Kohelet, Ecclesiastes says like the antidote is twofold. It's enjoying these gifts that God has given in, and then the end of the book, right? It is fearing God and keeping his commandments. And so that's the vision of life it presents. The vision of life is not don't smoke, drink, or chew, or go with girls who do. The vision of life is what it means to be a full human, right? Where it says that the Hebrew at the end is kol ha'adam, the whole of humanity. It doesn't say the whole duty like ESV. It says the whole of the human is to fear God and to keep his commandments. And that's like the Old Testament way of saying living in relationship with him. And so apologetically, or just like pastorally, if someone is like struggling with life, I'm saying, yes, life is a struggle. It is very difficult. And yet it doesn't matter if you are like Bill Gates or like in poverty. There is an opportunity to enjoy things like food and the job that God has given you. If he gives those things, that's another key part. Like Ecclesiastes is very clear that like these are gifts, they're not rights. That's, you know what I'm saying? Like it's not like God may choose not to give a gift, but he's still God. And so enjoying those things, which are like available regardless of socioeconomic status or where you live or anything like that, and within this relationship with God. And so I feel like it sounds corny, but man, it's so true that what it means to be a human, a true human, is living in right relationship with God. And as God allows it, like he gives us gifts that we can enjoy. And man, that is like so hopeful, I think, because it doesn't, it's not like, hey, if you're an Old Testament professor, or a scientist or an engineer, then you can enjoy life because you can afford to drive a nice car or eat nice food. It's saying no, the enjoyment is in the thing itself, right? Like that God allows you to enjoy the work, whatever that is. It doesn't matter if you're laying plumbing or swinging a hammer or hosting a podcast. Like the gift is in the enjoyment of the thing itself. And I just think that is awesome.
Absolutely. And it's a breath of fresh air, I think, for those that have a more stereotypical, or like how pastors and the Christian message is presented in society as a abstinence, right? Do not, I love the phrase, don't drink, don't chew, don't go with girls who do. I hadn't, my family said that growing up. I'd not thought about it in like 20 years. So thank you for just opening up some memories for me. But yeah, it's a breath of fresh air, isn't it? To say, no, this is still a good world, a fallen world, an upside down world. But there's goodness that God has instilled in it, and we can find that.
Right.
In your book, you start bringing us towards the highlight of what we're talking about here. When you start saying that there's two things we need to keep in mind to carpe diem, to seize the day, to enjoy those things. You say that we have to remember that the gifts are temporary and that the world is fallen. Just if I can briefly quote from page 68, you say this beautiful phrase: the fear of God shows us how to enjoy them. That is, the gifts that God gives us. Could you maybe elaborate on that? what is the fear of God to the author of Ecclesiastes, and how does that enable us to seize the day and enjoy the goodness that God has given us?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Fear of God, it was a difficult concept for me, like growing up and I feared my stepdad in the sense that like, man, who knows what's going to happen kind of thing. And so becoming a Christian and now like being a dad myself, it's difficult to think through like, okay, what does that mean to like, am I supposed to be terrified? Like, am I cowering in fear? Because, my dad might kill me. Like, I didn't think my dad or stepdad would kill me, but like, that's the kind of where we can go with that is like, we should be terrified of this angry God who's going to just strike us down as soon as he can, as soon as he has a justification for it. That's kind of was my thinking. But that is definitely not the fear that Ecclesiastes is talking about, or that the Old Testament, like Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, it's not what they're talking about. They use it as like a shorthand. Chris Hansberry says a shorthand for faith in Yahweh or trust in the Lord. And so it is not being terrified in the sense that we're terrified of like an angry person. It is definitely a fear in the sense of the Lord can and does punish his children. You know what I'm saying? And so it is like I don't want to totally take away any sort of negative connotation. Like it is a positive thing, but I don't want to like rob it of the fear elements because but it's a relationally based fear. And so an understanding that this God who loves me perfectly and is completely wise and knows what's best always, I need to do what he says. Because life is just not going to go well if I don't. And two, like there are like real serious, like actual consequences for sin, like in this life and the next. Like hell is a real place that people go to if they do not trust in Jesus. And like that is terrifying. Like it really is. And so like I don't want to take that away, but I do want to emphasize that it's like a relationally based concept of a God who is perfect, and that's like difficult, I think, for even someone with like the best relationship with their parents in the world. It's probably difficult to really get our minds around like we're in if we know Christ, we're in a relationship with a perfect God who perfectly loves us. We can kind of get close to that maybe, but I don't think we can fully understand it with like human analogies and stuff. But so it's relational, and it is like based in God's love for us, God's perfect wisdom, and knowing that like there are actual consequences for sin. And so I can remember once when I was married and had kids at this point. So I remember, and so I had to have been like 5 or 6 years ago, and I'd been clean for a long time, and I got super sick with a cold or flu or something like that. I go to the doctor, and I'm like talking to the doctor. I'm like, hey, listen, like I have a history of opiate abuse. I can't take any sort of like cough syrup with codeine. Like, don't prescribe it to me. I can't take it. And the doctor like writes me this prescription with cough syrup with codeine in it. And I'm sitting there in the doctor's office, like shaking, holding this. Sweat is literally coming off of my head, and I'm thinking like I could just go get this prescription filled. Like I wouldn't even have to tell my wife. Like I could just go get it filled, and like that's crazy thinking. I mean that's insane. And then I was just like overwhelmed with like, man, the cost to doing that is enormous. Like if I followed this path out to where it leads, like I could lose my wife, I could lose my children, I could lose my job, like I could have a lot to lose. And like God could kill me. I mean, like he hasn't, and but he certainly could if I have like known his goodness and his grace and I reject it. And so like I felt the fear of God in that moment, in the sense of like I want to, and it wasn't this like, it wasn't this like, oh man, my love for God is so overwhelming that I'm completely going to turn away from this sin. I wish it was that, but it was like, man, there's a lot to lose here if I go down this path. And so like that is a example in which like the fear of God kept me from sinning. You know, I like call my wife. I'm like, hey, the doctor did this, even though I asked him not to, and and so I didn't get the prescription filled, and I didn't go down this path. And so it was like really gracious of God that there is that I could see like, hey, the consequences of this action are really severe or potentially really severe. Um, and so thinking about these gifts of God, they're all things that we can misuse and exploit. Ecclesiastes lists work, a spouse, and wine. And like wine is obviously like an easy one to think about overindulgence, but I like to think of it as the fear of the Lord and living in relationship with Him are like guardrails on each side. Overindulgence and like complete abstinence. So even though the food is one where it's easy for me to like overindulge in food because it's not like I'm not like, well, I'm not getting drunk, I'm just eating a whole pizza. But when I use that as a means to like make myself feel better or not deal with difficulty, if I use that as a drug, essentially, that's like a misuse of that gift. And on the other hand, if I'm like, I know some people who are like, life gets stressful and they're like, the one thing I can control is food, so I'm not going to eat anything. And like both of those extremes are taking something and asking it to be God, essentially. And in the same way with like you could apply it to like work. The person who doesn't work at all refuses to work, and the person who's a workaholic, both are like extremes that are like God did not intend for. And so the fear of the Lord like allows us to enjoy those things like as God intended them, and not to worship them or ask them to do something for us that only God can do for us.
Excellent points. I'm sitting here going, I hope our churches didn't hear that too well, because we'll never have a church potluck again. We'll have to ban that. But Tim, you were going to
take them back to the festivals in Deuteronomy.
There we go. We could have better examples.
Yeah.
Well, and Russ, as you were talking, I think one of the things we try to do on this podcast is highlight, in a sense, the contribution that the Old Testament makes. And though I think obviously we see these same themes in the New Testament, the wisdom literature really does give us plainly that kind of cause and effect, both of sin and its consequence, but also the beauty and the gift of living life in relationship with God, or living in the fear of the Lord. And that doesn't spare us from pain. That doesn't spare us from the brokenness of the world. But it at least does give us a category to go beyond coping, to true and deep enjoyment. So maybe if you could just comment on the wisdom literature and how it contributes to a kind of more robust biblical theology. And I really love what you said about Ecclesiastes and it pointing us forward to an ultimate ending of the story where the upside down world is then turned right side up, that all sad things come untrue. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So one thing I love about wisdom literature is and I hate this. I hate this phrase. I feel like a hipster or a hippie when I say it. But wisdom literature is like so earthy, and it. I know the New Testament is awesome. Like when I read it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can see why people like this so much. But I feel like it's so like we're thinking about like all of these super spiritual things, which is good. But I think that the wisdom literature and the Old Testament in general, like brings home the point that all of life is spiritual, right? Like, so God is concerned with the houses we build. He's concerned with he's concerned with the food we eat, the clothes we wear. Like there's like all sorts of regulations around sex and sexuality. Like God is like in every single part of our lives. And I think one of the things that wisdom literature, Proverbs, does really well is it brings home that point that like the Christian life is not just about like praying and like going to church on Sunday. It should encompass like everything we do. It's a full-bodied
Mm.
uh, a full human experience. That's not something that we just do on Sundays or Wednesdays. It's something that we live out in absolutely every decision we make, every choice we make, every all of life. And man, if we can, I feel like if we as Christians can truly like recognize that like God is present and in and over absolutely everything, that can make a big difference, you know, in the way we see ourselves, and the way we see other humans, and the way we see God. And so, like, I love that about the wisdom literature. I love also that we have like Job, which is wrestling with suffering, and I think Ecclesiastes is also in its own way wrestling with suffering. And then Proverbs is this like whole book about wrestling with life, you know, that in the sense like, okay, we have all of these proverbs that give wisdom, but then like the goal of the book itself, I think, is to make us like meditate on scripture. Like that's part of the wisdom process, or part of the process of proverbs, is like figuring out which proverb applies when. And so it like drives, which brings us back to like Psalm 1, right, and Deuteronomy. Like we're supposed to be meditating on scripture day in and day out. And I think a really important way to do that is to recognize that like all of this life, all of it, when we're like teaching online or making dinner, like is worship to the Lord, or it should be. And then like, you know, it is, and so I used to not want to go to heaven. That's like a terrible thing to say, but because I thought that heaven was just like uh you would just be like playing a harp. I don't really like congregational singing. I do it because I, in some ways, I think it's great, but in other ways, I'm just like, I'd rather be like listening to a sermon or something like that. And so, like, I had this view of heaven. I was like, man, you just die and you float up, and then you like are basically in one long singing service. And like that might still be true. I don't know, but it's worth the risk, you know. And the but I feel like wisdom literature, with its emphasis on like the earthiness of life, helps us see that like, man, in the new heavens and the new earth, like we're not going to be just probably not going to be just like playing harps. We're going to be doing these things that God gave us to do in the Garden of Eden. You know, we're going to be working and enjoying relationship with one another, and feasting at the marriage supper of the Lamb. You know, there's this Jewish tradition, or it's in the, I can't remember if it's like in the Mishnah or the Talmud, that in when God remakes everything, then the wine that will be served at the feast is wine from original grapes in the Garden of Eden. And I thought, like, man, what a cool way, cool picture of like God's restoration of all things, you know. And so, yeah, to kind of like bring it back home and sum it up, I feel like this section of scripture, and the whole Old Testament, but this section of scripture makes us see that like all of our life should be like in worship to the Lord, and that like the next life is going to be similar but better, right? In that we're going to be doing the things, working and living and being in a relationship with another, but like in perfection, like without sin. And like that's what Christ has made possible. Like not, he hasn't made possible like just a disembodied existence where we we might like feel God's presence more or get goosebumps more. Like that's not what it is. It's going to be like a actual relationship in a different way that I can't even like imagine, with like the God of the universe and the people he's created in the world he's going to recreate. It's like pretty incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic point and practical example, listeners. Why you should be getting into Ecclesiastes and appreciating it is it does ground our faith, right? We've all met, I think, those that are, how's the phrase go? So heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. Right,
Mhm.
not focused on what is God doing here and now. And I think Ecclesiastes and Dr. Meek, I think your work especially reminds us that there is good work here and now, work to be enjoyed that is significant and meaningful. Um, Listeners, if you're here live with us, the link is in the chat. The book again is Ecclesiastes and the Search for Meaning in an Upside Down World. Before we let you go, Russ, do you have time for a few questions from the audience? There are a few in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So, a question that came in I thought was kind of interesting. So, for many of us, when we hear Abel and the connection to vanity, on the one hand, that maybe starts to make sense, but the story of Abel is a story of betrayal. So, maybe flesh that out. Is betrayal part of this idea of capturing an upside down world, or maybe what specifically is the author here in Ecclesiastes going for in that connection?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different things that the author. I will agree that the story is about betrayal in one sense. Like definitely, like Cain betrays Abel. My middle son is named. Actually, sorry, not my middle son. My youngest son is named Abel. And when he was little, him and his brother, they're 4 months apart. And so once I like looked outside and they're like 2 years old, and Elijah has like this rock over his head and he's like kind of stumbling toward Abel. So I like run outside. I'm like, I know how the story ends. This is not good. So anyway, so yeah, there is like that element of betrayal in there. But I think that what the author is pointing at is maybe like different aspects. So I think that our job as readers is to, when we see that word vanity or meaningless, to think Abel. And then we think, okay, what aspect of Abel's life and story does this refer to? And I think it can refer to the brevity of his life, or the transitoriness, the vaporousness of it. I think it can refer to the injustice that he experienced, like being the righteous one who essentially got the rewards of wickedness. He died early. And so I don't think when Ecclesiastes uses Hevel, I don't think he's necessarily thinking about like betrayal, other than like that betrayal like really is, you should be able to trust your brother not to kill you. And yet Abel couldn't do that. And so like there is that aspect of like, this is not the way it's supposed to be. This isn't how God made families. They didn't make them to betray one another. And so, but I think we need to think of the word Hevel in terms of like, okay, how does this reflect the story of Abel? And that could be in its transitoriness or in the upside downness, or the injustice that he experienced, something along those lines.
Does Hebrews 11:4 maybe help us here that although dead, he still speaks? Speaking of Abel and the significance of his story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about that passage a lot. In that, Abel is like the first martyr, and so even though his life is cut short, and that is also really helpful for us thinking about the eternal significance. In that, even though Abel's life is cut short, like his blood does cry out from the ground, and then like in its own upside down kind of way, and like this is like really twisted to even say, but like Abel ends up winning because like he goes on to be with the Lord. Like you know what I'm saying? Like he enters paradise. Like that's not a bad thing at all. Like yes, like his life was cut short, but like his eternal life began. And so, yeah, definitely, I think that is like his, in a like a paradoxical way, his life is cut short, and yet his testimony kind of rings out forever. You know.
Yeah. The irony of judging by the world standards versus God's standards, right? Because from an outside
Mm-hmm,
perspective, we might
mm-hmm,
go, "Oh no, Cain definitely won because he gets this long life." But I think you're quite right to say,
mm-hmm,
uh, no. Look, Abel has the lasting testimony that shapes us.
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
I had a question not from the chat, but I was like, "How often do I have an Ecclesiastes expert here to ask?" Um, how is Solomon connected to this book? Is he the author? Is it just about him? This is something I don't have fully settled in my mind. We've actually debated this earlier in season 3. So if you don't mind me putting you on
Yeah.
the spot, what do we do with Solomon and this book?
Well, I think that Solomon seriously complicates the way that we read and understand the book, this book, Proverbs and
Mm,
Song of Songs. Like sometimes I'm like, why is I wish this it's like you know, like when you find out that like well this no never mind, I won't say that, but uh you like find out some horrible thing that like your favorite writer did, and then you're like, man, do I have to go burn all his books now? You know, and so I feel
yeah.
like it's like that with Solomon. You know, it's like, oh, geez, I think he really complicates the way we interpret the book. If nothing else, because we and it and yeah, nothing else because we see like, dude, this guy made some horrible life decisions. Um, so one thing so I wrote this article a long time ago about the authorship of Ecclesiastes because, like it can't people. I haven't experienced this in like a lot of years, but it can be one of those things where people say like, man, if you don't hold the Solomonic authorship, like you're rejecting inerrancy or you're
Mm,
rejecting the authority of Scripture or like you're rejecting all of these things that are true about the Bible. So I will say, I don't think that Solomonic authorship is a litmus test for any sort of Orthodox Christian faith. Um, I think that there is a really solid case for Solomonic authorship because of the allusions to Solomon. I mean, like I was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I mean, like it could be a literary device. That's like absolutely possible and within the realm of orthodoxy. It could be a scribe who's like writing in the voice of Solomon. All of those things, because he doesn't ever come out and say like I Solomon wrote this, and so I think that should give us pause, definitely to say like maybe it wasn't Solomon. Luther didn't hold the Solomonic authorship, uh, but um, but if you were like had a knife to my throat and were like you have to make a decision right now, I would definitely lean towards Solomonic authorship. Um, because of the I was king over Israel and Jerusalem, because that like really narrows your possibilities, unless it's a
sure.
literary device, um, which is possible. And then the like his building projects and like the wisdom, it seems like that in Ecclesiastes is alluding to First Kings,
Mm.
Um, so that's like a real good waffly scholar answer to say at the end of the day, I don't know, but
Well, no, it makes me feel better because I like how you said it complicates things as soon as we bring Solomon in because I've wrestled with that, especially in Song of Songs. I even
mm-hmm.
said a couple episodes back, I'm like, it feels really weird to have a book on sex from like the Bible's greatest sex addict, uh,
Yeah.
and that makes it complicated to interpret and understand the meaning. So, uh, thank you
Mm-hmm.
for indulging my personal question, Tim. I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. Did you have any questions before we let Dr. Meek go?
I don't have a question, but just a comment, and you can feel free to respond to it. Um, I loved your answer about the wisdom literature in Ecclesiastes, and I really feel this because I have so many friends when we talk about the nuns, the NONES who grew up in the
Mm,
church but are leaving the church. Um, so many of them, I think, could relate well to the Old Testament if it weren't for the caricature that they're often given of it. And so that's in some small way my hope. And I just hear your heartbeat as well, that God will really use something that, many people argue is antiquated or somehow to be set aside. And of course, we're not under the law, but this is God's word that still helps us to see Him and to know what it means to be in relationship with Him. And so I had a friend who was an atheist at one point in his life, and he eventually gave his heart to the Lord. And one of the things that I said to him at one point was, I always believed that you were going to find truth because you were looking for it. And to me, that's something that, in a sense, encapsulates the wisdom literature, is that people who truly want to find truth, they may not find an answer, but they're going to find a person in the Lord. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
there's always hope for me, for people who are on that journey. And I think Ecclesiastes really captures that journey in all of its messiness, and all of its, giftedness. But I'm so thankful for your heart. I'm thankful for your work and your contributions, and our common love of the Old Testament as something that points us forward, ultimately to Christ and the hope that we have in Him.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely. Dr. Meek, thank you so much for coming on to our podcast tonight. It's been really good to talk with you. And listeners, I can't recommend this book highly enough because Dr. Meek, as he's already shared here, brings his story into it. And so if you want to see a very helpful application, not just good theological information, but seeing how it plays out in someone's life, go pick up this book. Dr. Meek, if people want to know more about your work or see what else you are currently producing, where can they find you in our great internet?
Uh, rustmeek.com. So russmeek.com, and it's I need to update it, but that's where I put stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I was on there today. You've got some excellent articles. You've got links to your books. So go check it out and pick up this book if you can, listeners, because I think it'll be helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Meek. We really appreciate your time. Listeners, next week we are coming back together for our final episode of 2023. It'll be kind of a retrospective, Tim and I, as we look back over this first year of the podcast, answer some of your questions that have come in, and also begin forecasting out what 2024 is going to look like. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope this podcast has really helped encourage you, not just to read the Old Testament, but to read the wisdom literature, to see how faith touches you where you live, to see how God's love for us and the fear of God gives us guide rails to enjoy the goodness of this life. Until next week, as always, stay cool and stay old. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.